When we take a look at the legal issues and the regulations for least restrictive environment, and especially in an emotionally charged behavioral case study like this one, we need to ask ourselves some questions. Reminding you of the very basic definition that we started with at the beginning of this lecture, one of the things we need to determine is if the district ensured that the student was educated with his or her peers. The answer to that is no. The district did not ensure that. But unfortunately, that's not the entire question. The entire question is, did the district ensure that the student was educated with his or her peers to the maximum extent appropriate? So we know that student has been removed from the least restrictive environment, but is it appropriate? That's where the subjective part comes in, the part where we have to consider all of the data and all of the discussion from all of the stakeholders and determine if removal from least restrictive environment into more restrictive placements away from his or her peers is appropriate. So once that starts to happen, we need to decide if that decision was made because education in the general ed setting with use of supplementary aids and services could not be achieved satisfactorily. Well, I can tell you right now, the disturbance caused by the student for other gen ed, both staff and students, and the damage to the student, him or herself, based on the behaviors they're exhibiting, we know that right now that cannot happen satisfactorily. But we need to determine why that's not happening through the supplementary aids and services, whether they're offered or not offered. And that only comes from the data, like the data we've listed in those charts. Now, I know a case study is a simulation and it's not the perfect example, or it's not the perfect part to go from, but it gives you a start of looking for the evidence to know that the placement decisions we're making are appropriate and help make that student's individualized education achievable. And that's exactly what the state of Michigan is doing with their LRE auditing process that started in the fall. Do you have the documentation and evidence? Have you had the discussions with all of the stakeholders, including the family, about why we place students where we put them for the least restrictive environment? I'm going to give you one example that I pulled from this case study that I'm going to cite as a problem legally and with our regulations. At one point in the case study, I think it's towards the bottom, it states very clearly the district did not have any other special education programs beside the resource program. Right there, huge red flag, huge compliance problem. It gives me a little bit more insight into this case, that if this is a small district, possibly a public charter school, possibly a district with a different model of education, and the only support or services that they offer fall under the resource program umbrella, that is legally non-compliant. Least restrictive environment depends upon a continuum of services for students with all needs and all intensities of needs. So if one of the reasons the district is putting this student in an online program with separate staff and in separate settings is because they don't offer anything other than a resource program, that's a problem. And they're minimizing the student's least restrictive environment based on the services that they offer, not on the data from the student. So that's just one example of a very real legal issue with this case study. I encourage you to dive into those resources that I provided for this week, the 3 that were required reading, and skim the other 2, and really pick your own red flags and pick a couple of issues in your brain, or even maybe some that are happening in your classrooms, programs, and districts right now, and go ahead and find where that is in our law and in our legal expectations. They can be problems like I've identified, or they can also be affirming positive practices and interventions and supplementary aids and services that you're able to offer in your schools and programs.